There's a study on childhood neglect and emotional dysregulation, a mediated pathway through emotional insecurity. And the study found that individuals who experience childhood neglect are more likely to develop emotional insecurity, which in turn contributes to emotional dysregulation in adulthood. That is so resonant, and it really just makes so much sense. If you've been emotionally neglected and your parents were not attuned to your emotional needs, if you weren't modeled emotions, if you weren't taught emotions, you're not going to have security in the realm of emotions, holding emotions, showing emotions, expression, processing. You are going to have an insecurity. Why do some emotions seem impossible to process? For many, the struggle with emotional processing is deeply rooted in our earliest experience and the body's response to trauma. It's not just in your head, it's in your nervous system. We release a conversation with Julie Tom on the impacts of our emotional health into our physical health. And so today we're looking to dive a little bit further into this conversation, really focusing on the emotional processing aspect of emotions. So, welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm an educator at the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, and I'm also a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, where I bridge the power of your nervous system into your peak somatic experiences.
And I'm your co-host, Elisabeth Kristof, founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we work with applied neurology, somatics, and emotional processing for resilience, stress processing, and behavior change. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification Program, where we help coaches, therapists, leaders to bridge the gap from somatic work to nervous system work and mindset. I'm really glad to be having this conversation and going a little bit deeper because I think this is such an important topic. Before we dive too much deeper into it, I do really want to help people connect some dots because it can be a big leap to think about your physical symptoms, your health outcomes being connected to your emotional experience. And there are so many resources available to start to explore this. Julie mentioned reading some books about it in our conversation, and that was really helpful for me too. So the book When the Body Says No, or The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate has tons of research about this topic. And of course, The Body Keeps the Score was a pivotal work for starting to look at this. And then as I was researching, there's just so much research out there to validate that our emotional health is deeply tied to our physical health. There were studies on the relationship between emotional repression and chronic pain that really looked at how repressed emotions, particularly anger and sadness, could be associated with chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia or tension headaches, and really suggested through the findings that this contributes to chronic pain because of the increases in muscle tension and that perpetual stress response that goes on in the body. There's so much research looking at the link between immune function, physical health, and emotional repression. There was a big meta-analysis from 2004 where they reviewed several studies linking emotional repression to weakened immune function and concluded that people who habitually repress emotions have lower quality immune responses and are more susceptible to illness, including autoimmune disease. There's a lot of links between autoimmune disease and emotional repression. And we can certainly dive into these studies, but I just want people to know that that evidence exists and that when we're talking about emotional processing, we're really talking about stress processing. And when we're talking about emotional processing, that is stress processing. So if we can't emote, then we're staying in these states of constant dysregulation, in these high stress states. And that leads to all the other impacts that we talk about on here all of the time, right? Issues with the adrenal system, hormone dysregulation, sleep disturbances, muscle tension, poor gut function. And so in order to be able to regulate our nervous system, because it is the same processes in the body, we need emotional regulation for the health of our nervous system.
I think it's really important to remember that emotional repression is stressful in the body. That is what we're talking about. Just that's the very bottom line of it. And another great resource, we talked a little bit about back pain yesterday, and John Sarno has a great book called Healing Back Pain. And I recommend that to a lot of people who do experience back pain as an output. And it's been really helpful. It's particularly helpful. I know that we particularly have a higher female audience, and A lot of you have partners that are experiencing back pain. And I think sometimes when we're in our emotional work and we want our partners, our male partners, to be in the work, it's easier for them to hear that from a male voice. And so I particularly find the John Sarno, I mean, Gabor Mate, of course, we're talking about a lot of male contributors here, to speak to like the autoimmune and the gut health. I think that's why we start coming to this so much later in life. A lot of people don't learn that they have an autoimmune until you're in your 20s, your 30s. I'm experiencing it now in my 40s. It's kind of coming into my awareness. So that is much later. Now we're talking about what's happened after decades of repressing emotions. And it's the same thing with gut health. We often don't tackle our gut health until we're decades into it. Even though I knew from a very early age I had a gut thing, it manifests because it gets to a point where you can't ignore it anymore in the body. It came to a point where I cannot ignore my gut any longer. And then through healing my gut, learning that I have MCAS, which is, I don't know if that's just like a straight autoimmune or something I'm identifying as an autoimmune, because it does feel autoimmune-y.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just having a conversation with one of our NSI practitioners yesterday who was reaching out and is at a place where they are seeing a lot of these outputs in their life, behavioral, but also physical. And was like, I just don't understand, why did this happen? Like, I can't think of this big childhood trauma, and I don't have a traumatic brain injury. Like, why is this way? And we had to kind of talk about, a lot of this stuff is cumulative. It's built up over time, and we learn to push through. We're really adaptive beings, and we learn all of these ways to disconnect from our pain, to push through the pain, to mask, to um, continue to function in the world. Even though our body's speaking to us, we can still get by. That is still building up over time in the body. And what happens for a lot of us is that at some point, just like you were talking about, Jen, it reaches like a tipping point, and then there might be some incident that kind of pushes the water level over the bucket edge, so that we're experiencing these really big outputs, or it might just be built up over time. And then we find ourselves in this place where it's like, man, I have some pretty severe outputs going on, but it didn't start with one particular incident. And it doesn't even have to come from like the traditional traumas that you think of, big, sexual abuse or physical abuse. It can be chronic stress that comes from a variety of places, a high stress job for a long time, emotional neglect, which we're going to talk about today, all kinds of ways, living in a world that really isn't conducive for nervous system health, just for our entire life, and operating in a way that doesn't work for our unique brain and body expression. And so there's usually not one specific incident, but these are accumulated adaptations and chronic dysregulation that manifest over time.
And particularly if you've experienced emotional neglect as one of your ACE scores, it's one of ours that we've talked about, came up in our conversation with Julie Tom. And there's a study on childhood neglect and emotional dysregulation, a mediated pathway through emotional insecurity. And the study found that individuals who experience childhood neglect are more likely to develop emotional insecurity, which in turn contributes to emotional dysregulation in adulthood. That is so resonant, and it really just makes so much sense. If you've been emotionally neglected and your parents were not attuned to your emotional needs, if you weren't modeled emotions, if you weren't taught emotions, you're not going to have security in the realm of emotions, holding emotions, showing emotions, expression, processing. You are going to have an insecurity. And it's one for me that I still have to catch myself when I am being neglected emotionally. It will even take me a while to notice because it's patterned so well. It's the ACE score that continues to live on through my life, and to catch it and to be aware of it and then to move out of that, because I immediately notice, well, let's define emotional neglect before I go on to a little bit further. And as I said, for me, emotional neglect really, I think I've kind of already defined it. It was that lack of attunement, that lack of just acknowledgement. It was the neglect was my emotions being shut down, they weren't allowed to be, it's not that they weren't allowed to be talked about, but no one ever wanted to talk about them. And when I wanted to talk about them, I got shut down. It has had a devastating effect on me as I move through this world. And like I'm saying, identifying with autoimmune now. And so it's a really hard, I find it's the hardest ACE score, and it goes way beyond my sexual trauma, my early childhood sexual trauma.
Yeah, definitely. I think we did a whole episode on emotional neglect that would be great to revisit for people because it's nuanced and it's hard to identify sometimes. And so for me, there's two big places where I see it really showed up in my development. And one is just the absence of a caregiver, just really a physical absence of someone there that could attune to me and regulate with me, right? Like, and this again, it's not to put blame on anyone, but my mom was a single mom and she had to work a lot. And I spent a lot of time alone, right? And so I'm dealing with all these emotions. We had immigrated to the United States when I was 4. English was not my first language. I didn't have a community that I could connect to. I couldn't even communicate with people when I first moved here. And then the one person that I could communicate with was gone a lot because she was working. And so there was no one there to process the stress of that with. And so those emotions were really overwhelming to my little nervous system. Didn't have a place where I could safely process that or anyone to show me any kind of a skill to do that. And so I learned to repress it. I learned to find maladaptive coping behaviors. Self-harm was something I started at a really early age. Binge eating was something I started at a really early age to manage these big emotional experiences. I didn't have another way. And then the other thing too is when I did have my mom there, my primary, and my grandma sometimes, um, my emotions, they were really big, right? I was really dysregulated. I had this big disorganized attachment, the early childhood sexual abuse, all of this stuff going on. And I would have these massive tantrums. And my mom was already really stressed out. And that stressed out my mom more. And my little nervous system understands that. It feels that. And so there's a threat to dysregulating your caregiver because that leads to a less stable environment for yourself. And so again, adaptively, you start to learn to repress these big expressions of emotion that are naturally coming out because it doesn't feel safe to do that because it's making your environment too unstable because the primaries don't have the skill to hold the space for those emotions. What most healing and personal development programs don't tell you is that your patterns, your behaviors, your emotional responses are outputs of your nervous system trying to keep you safe. And changing your thoughts won't change those deep-rooted patterns. You have to go deeper. Inside rewiretrial.com, you'll learn how to train your nervous system for greater capacity so that you can navigate life with more ease, more presence, more connection. We have 5 live classes a week with expert instructors. We have an on-demand library with thousands of recorded neurosomatic training sessions. And we have an incredible, supportive, inclusive community of people just like you doing this deep work together. You don't have to keep fighting against your own nervous system. You can repattern it. Start your 2 free week trial now at rewiretrial.com.
And dissociation. When we have caregivers that are dissociated, that is also a level of emotional neglect because if you are not here, even if you are here with me, but I can feel your lack of presence, I'm going to know that we are not connected. I'm going to feel your disconnect and know that I am now part of this too. And I may start to take that on as my fault. And that would be another reason for me to turn my emotions down, to just go a little bit silent, maybe just like not even silent in my voice, but how silent I am just moving around in the environment and in the home. And it is so stressful as a young person to think that it's your fault. I still think it's my fault when I catch that I'm experiencing it right now with my caregivers. I'm experiencing emotional neglect. And I went through about 3 or 4 days where I really thought it's me. I'm bad. I caused this. It's the way that I developed. I was shaped in this emotional dysregulation. I was shaped in this trauma, and now it's my fault. It is my fault that I am not being connected to in the way that I need to. And it's not my fault. It is really not my fault. And it's a lot to take on. And I understand that there's a lot of shame that comes up in the emotional neglect space from a primary, because if I can't get my emotional needs met, my God, you'd think if anyone, you should get your emotional needs met through your primary. But if I can't, and when I need to, I experience shame as it's the first output that comes through, because I think I am bad. I am the bad one.
It really reminds me, as you were talking, it reminded me of another study that I was looking at on the impact of childhood emotional neglect on emotional dysregulation, the role of attachment and self-compassion. And the study found that when we have emotional neglect in childhood, it really significantly predicted emotional dysregulation in adults, but particularly low levels of self-compassion and insecure attachment. And, there's just so many reasons that emotional neglect and dissociation occurs, right? It's not just on the primary. We live in a society that really teaches us to disconnect from our body, to push through pain, to push through emotional sensations. It is the norm to not have these skills, right? From mother to mother to mother, just being passed down of like, we just aren't connected. And so then we're born into these environments where the people raising us also don't have the skills and get really dysregulated with emotions. And there's certain cultural components to that. There's a lot of different cultures where you just don't talk about the things that you're feeling. And yeah, just like you said, then that all gets internalized back on the child, and we adapt. How can I change myself to make this environment safer for me? How can I change myself to keep greater levels of regulation and stability, to keep my attachments connected? And so, one of the big ways that we learn to change ourselves is to be less emotionally expressive.
It's really hard to have self-compassion when in your foundation you are bad. If I am bad, how am I going to have compassion for that? I'm just going to be seeing myself through the lens of a failure in all ways. And then you can see, or I can see how that then shaped my romantic partnerships. I can see the sexual promiscuity even coming out. I don't know that the sexual promiscuity only has to do to the early childhood sexual abuse. I really think it goes to seeking out for the emotional connection, because we know intimacy gives us connection. And so I really feel like I can see the string of, well, y'all know if you've been listening to this podcast that I'm on a journey still of celibacy and because, and it's a big part of, wait, let me back up a little bit. I can see the string of romantic partners that I had in my life. They were all emotionally available. And what I craved the most was the emotional connection. And choosing unavailable emotional partners meant that I still had to change my emotion. I still had to shut that down. And it's a lot to contend with, to be quite honest with you.
It really is. It's a journey that we're on here, because still I can find, and we've done so much work. I'm on the site
How to do
once a
that.
week, emotionally processing with people in community and safe spaces. You and I do so much work together. And it's still like, when emotions show up in real time, like, yes, when I'm in that space of like, it's time to process my emotions and I'm teaching my nervous system those skills, and that's okay. But like, when I'm moving through regular world and my emotions come up and I express them, there's usually a component of that I feel some shame come up in my body afterwards. I have like this, I will get flighty, right? Like, I was vulnerable, I expressed around these people in this situation, and all of a sudden I got to get out of here. I don't want to stay in this space. I said too much. I was too vulnerable, even sometimes when we do it on this podcast, right? There's just this
Mhm.
automatic reflexive reaction of, oh my gosh, I exposed too much. I let too much come through. And it has been a real journey of then working with that shame, mobilizing out of the freeze that comes with that, using self-soothing, using nervous system regulation, getting out in nature, and trying little by little to have more curiosity about my emotions so that I'm taking away that, like, I know what this means, or this is a bad emotion, this is a good emotion. Can I just tie into feeling the sensations, honoring the natural processes, little by little, exploring it? What does the sensation really look like? What does it remind me of? Does it have a color? Does it have a texture? Is there a sound that goes with it? And gradually repatterning the beliefs that I have about the emotions and coming at them from more of a neutral place. This is just a natural expression. This is my body being a human body.
There's many different levels, I think, to come at it from, or many different places that you can come at emotional processing, right? Because you've just said, a number of things like about beliefs and what am I feeling? Where does it come from? What does this remind me of? And I think it does take a level of cognitive awareness to be able to have these conversations with ourselves, which then I think takes a level of regulation. If we are not regulated, we are not going to have the capacity to explore things, but so far before it just continues to trigger more outputs and more protection, even through the exploration. So, this is why so much of the daily practice, and when I'm working with clients, we might start with a little light stress processing, but we do not start in emotions. Like, that's not the place where we start. So, it's back to the daily practice that we talk about. And as Elizabeth said, we're on site 4 and 5 times a week teaching, and you can have the same, like, you can start building this for yourself, building this resilience to go into some of these emotional processing that we're going to talk about today by joining Rewire Trial, getting 2 free weeks, and start learning tools to expand your capacity and lower the overall stress. Because we talked last week a lot about shame, about freeze. Chronic fatigue is one too that I'll really notice an output of when I'm just like, when I'm repressing, when something's happened that I feel like I'm kind of starting to shut down. It's chronic fatigue and food.
Mhm.
It's like I get so tired, but I'm too wired to rest in the fatigue. So to really shut myself down, I need the food to regulate me through the protection of the freeze and the fatigue so that then I might actually get some rest. But the rest is just to almost to like integrate a little bit more. Not necessarily the rest isn't resolving any of the emotions. The rest is just to lower the stress.
I think there's something really nuanced about what you said that I want to highlight a little bit here. There's different types of fatigue and rest, right? There's like, I need rest after emotional processing to be able to integrate, and I need rest throughout my life. We've spent a lot of time on this season talking about the importance of rest so that we can recover and positively adapt. And then there's chronic fatigue and that big lethargy that sometimes comes when I'm repressing an emotion, and it's my system putting the brakes on. It's a real output of my nervous system going into like a flop response, a deep freeze
Mhm.
and a flop response, where something will happen, an emotion will be triggered. I'm maybe not even aware of it, but it taps into that deep place of, there's some big anger, there was maybe related to a boundary or a sense of betrayal or an attachment um, wound. And suddenly it's like, I can barely sit up. I can barely hold my head up. I'm truly flopping. And I've had to learn to start very gently mobilizing through that. And I've had some experiences of, you know, once I have been practicing emotional processing and emotional regulation regularly so that when I'm in those moments, it's not completely impossible for me to do that. And if I can start to, in that moment, take the fatigue as a signal that there's something that needs to be processed here, I can start gently mobilizing, gently emoting, and then big stuff will come through. And all of a sudden, after that, I'm not so tired, right? My energy comes back. I can think more clearly. I'm present again in my body. But again, it's this practice of really starting to train those skills intentionally in a little by little way in safe times so that when those moments hit, I have the skill to to do that.
Yeah, we talked about that last week a lot, didn't we? Like getting things in real time. And it can be hard. It could take days for me sometimes to realize that I'm repressing something. And I'll only catch it through my behaviors. It's one of the best ways to be able to catch ourselves is when we are in the behavior. And you know, let's talk a little bit about the mobilizing while we're here because it came up also in that conversation, like how do we mobilize? And for us, that looks like we have so many different resources now: vocalizing, tapping, bouncing, shaking. Sometimes for me, it just looks like swaying back and forth or on the ground. A lot of times I find that my processing, I go to the ground, even if I like to sit on the floor also a lot. So I'm just kind of comfortable on those lower spaces. And any little bit of movement, any tapping on my body that I can do, and just try to get any movement. And sometimes then it's like, okay, now I can feel my back. So now my back is kind of getting involved. And maybe I could just like do some hip stuff, like windshield wipering things. And then maybe that can just get a little bit bigger. And so it really, I think, we talk about minimum effective dose. And I think as far as mobilizing, it also for me starts really small.
Absolutely. Me too. Even though I am someone, I love to move. I love big movement. But when I'm in those spaces, it's got to start small. And Julie mentioned starting with like the feet and the hands, and the face, sensory stimulus to those areas. And like you, a lot of times I go to the ground, I lay down, I can start to connect with those sensations of like where I am making contact with the floor. Can I feel a little bit supported by my seat or the floor? Start to anchor into some of those sensations, externally orient, feel my clothes on my skin, look around the room. And then maybe there's some gentle movement of my toes. Maybe there's some intentional tapping and pressure on my fingers. And then that builds a little bit, like you said, and then I can kind of roll around or sway and let myself get a little bit more intuitive with it. And then that might kind of build up to a bigger climax of like some big sounds come out or some tears or some shaking. Not always though, right? Sometimes it's just a little bit of rolling around.
And I really like something that I try to focus on too when I am on the ground is that as I'm experiencing maybe shame as an output of this, I really try to stay open with my body expression. I try not to curl in any further into the shame so that I'm not flexing into it. It's already rounding us and turning us into more of a fetal position. So sometimes, actually, that's a really great point. Sometimes it's about being in the fetal position and then pulling myself out. It's like curling into a ball and then releasing myself fully into that because I want to keep my chest open to the emotional expression because I'm trying to keep my heart open. Really, that's what I'm thinking about.
Yes, and just noticing those patterns is like just having the awareness and starting to see the patterns in your body is so impactful. Like for me, a lot of times it happens with my hands. I'll notice I'm just clenching my fists and I'll just think, can I open my hands and spread out my fingers? Can I do that a
Mhm.
few times? Can I get some movement there? Or I'll notice that I'm clenching my jaw. Can I take a couple intentional yawns? And just start to gradually come out of that bracing gently, and then
Yeah.
where are the places where I am moving into those reflexive patterns and can I just kind of shift into some opening and some ease with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the most valuable things for me has been starting to train my interoceptive system. So we talk about this a lot in here. It's the system that allows you to feel and recognize and process the signals that are coming from inside of your body, right? It's the system that tells us it's our sensory system for inside of us. And when we are very disconnected, when we have a lot of dissociation from our body, it can really start to dull those signals where I don't have the ability to interoceptive accuracy or I don't have the interoceptive awareness to even feel them. And then because I haven't been feeling them for a long time, I've become hypersensitive to them as well, right? So I don't have interoceptive accuracy. I'm interpreting too much threat to those signals. When I do feel something inside, oh my God, brain goes into panic. I'm pushed often into a reflexive F response. And so, can I start to work with that system through gentle interoceptive stimulus, regulating around that, maybe feeling those sensations for a moment, maybe starting away from my head, away from my deep intrinsic core, just feeling my feet, regulating around that, maybe doing some gentle vibration on my stomach or wearing an ab belt or something for those non-myelinated C fibers in the abdomen that give interoceptive stimulus to our brain, to our insular cortex. And can I find these little ways to start to rehabilitate that system so that I have more interoceptive awareness, the ability to feel the signals, and then more interoceptive accuracy to respond to them appropriately?
It's important to know how your body is talking to you, right? Especially we've talked about bracing and tension so much today. It's important to know when you are bracing, right? It's doing so much internally that I don't think people are really probably even considering when it comes to like our organs or the vagus nerve, right? That vagus nerve is just going to get more impinged the more we brace. And it's so energy costly for our bodies to be bracing. And, there are ways that our body speaks to us in so many levels, right? Our body tells us that we're hungry. Our body tells us that there's a threat. Our body is telling us no when we're propelling into yes. Our body is always signals come in sensations and words and images, in feelings through the body. And it's interesting. One thing that I have to catch myself on interoception is not so much the bracing. This is going to be one of the ways that my body speaks, because like I will sometimes ignore when I have to pee. And I'll often do it at night, not throughout the day. But if I fall asleep early on the couch and I have to move myself to bed, I'll sometimes have a thought like, oh, I really kind of have to go to the bathroom, but I'm too tired. I will 100% not sleep through the night.
Mm, yeah.
That signal that I ignore is then now going to interrupt my sacred sleep. And so I really have to make that conscious effort at night to be like, I need to go to the bathroom before I go to bed.
This is a perfect example of starting to work with our interoceptive system and how to recognize if you have some interoceptive deficits. So, like, one is we hear those signals, but we don't go to the bathroom because we're just pushing through, and then interrupting our sleep. The other, though, is if we have some real interoceptive deficits, we might not even hear these signals. We might not be aware of them. So, if you're a coach, therapist, or practitioner, and you know you want to work at the root level of the nervous system, but you're looking for practical tools, strategy, and a framework, visit us at neurosomatic.com to learn more about our ICF accredited coaching certification. If you have a lot of interoceptive deficits, it might look like you don't know you need to go to the bathroom until it's an emergency. Like all of a sudden, oh my God, I really need to pee. I really need to go to the bathroom. But I didn't hear or perceive any of those signals. They were there. They were coming from my body earlier before this emergency state. Or I don't know I'm hungry until I'm like starving or I'm lightheaded or I'm starting to get really irritable, right? Those signals have been there earlier, but I don't have the interoceptive awareness to be able to feel them. And then also, what are my patterns of ignoring those signals and just pushing through? And so it's both, right? Like maybe I don't hear them and maybe I push through them. And then there's lots of ways, just making some of that being your interoceptive training, starting to try to recognize earlier when I might be getting hungry, when I'm thirsty. We talked with Dr. Megan Anna about some really gentle interoceptive training of just holding a cold smoothie and feeling those cold sensations and the temperature changes. So there's all these little ways you can start to condition yourself to pay more attention to the signals and to start to get those pathways a little bit more active.
And all of that will then feed into being able to feel your emotions, right? Because we have to start smaller. If I can listen to the cues of like, I'm hungry, I have to go to the bathroom, then maybe I'm going to move into, oh, I'm bracing. Okay, this is what bracing feels like. And then as it starts to build, then we start to have that capacity for the emotional processing.
Yep.
That we would be having a struggle with. And then we might even be able to make the connections of like feeling something in the body to an emotional event or to an experience that we've come out of. And then it's like, okay, so we all have to start on a really small level, minimum effective dose before we can climb the ladder of what's really possible
Absolutely.
in the emotional states.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the key takeaway for me as we're talking about this is just to help people start to think about where some of these outputs might be coming from, the emotional layers underneath, and then what are small ways that I can start to work with my system to be able to increase my capacity for emotional regulation, for emotional processing, and remembering that it's a journey and you start where you're at. And even just being curious about it, even just starting to think about it is an amazing place to start and see where it takes you.
We just have to start somewhere, right? We just have to start. And maybe for you, that's going to be a book, one of the books that we've recommended today. Maybe it's going to be getting on site with us. We have other resources too that we'll have in the show notes for you. And knowing too that all of this can change your experience.
It's worth it.
God, it's so worth it. It's so worth it to have honesty in your relationships where you can say, I'm experiencing this. I don't need you to fix me. I need you to hear me. I
Yes.
need you to see me, because that's so much about the misattunement and the emotional neglect is not feeling seen and not feeling heard. So community is so important. We love our brain-based community for that. And having friends and people in your life that, or maybe it's someone, a practitioner that you work with.
Absolutely. And I think too, as we start to process our emotions and become more comfortable with emotions, we can also show up for other people in that way, right? Like I can show up and bear witness, and that makes for a much deeper life experience, right? And not only am I getting to experience some of these big, overwhelming emotions, but I also now have capacity to feel joy, to feel connection, to feel excitement in an embodied, full way. And I can be with others in community experiencing that. And there is, gosh, that makes for such a different life experience. And it's worth the time.
The authenticity of emotions is so valuable. And I mean, think that's like taking away the mask.
It is. And one more thing I was thinking about as you were talking too, not only do we get to be more authentic in our relationships with other people, but in our relationship with ourself too, right? Now I'm
Yeah.
not emotionally neglecting myself. I'm not perpetuating that pattern with myself. I can witness me. I can start to tune
Yeah.
into my instinct, hear myself, trust myself, and, be present with my body as it's expressing. And that is the most powerful relationship that I have with in my life now is with myself and my body.
And oftentimes, I mean, like with anything, when we repress and we bring that in, who's being affected by that? Not the other person, not the experience that you just left, not the situation. The stress all falls back onto our bodies. And then rewiring for self-compassion is huge. It's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Y'all, we really hope to see you on site, access the other resources in the show notes, and join us. Get on this journey. We are totally here to hold you and support you as much as we possibly can.
Thank you for joining us.